50 years ago this week, 250,000 people marched on Washington to demand jobs, equality, and justice. This past Saturday, almost as many people marched again to commemorate the first march and to demand jobs, equality, and justice. Hi, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Up next on Another View, we'll talk about the March on Washington in historical context and with those who participated in 63 and 2013. It's an Another View history lesson coming up next, right after this news from NPR.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
Iconic words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the 1963 March on Washington. Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Welcome to Another View. This week, we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, while at the same time asking the question, did the march do any good? Are we any better off now as a nation than we were then? Joining me to discuss the March on Washington is Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, history professor at Norfolk State University and the director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the African Diaspora Studies. Hi, Cassandra.
Hello.
Welcome back again.
Thank you.
Dr. William Alexander, professor of history, also at Norfolk State. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Fine, thank
Good.
you.
And Dr. John Whitley with the Williamsburg-York James City County NAACP. Hi.
Hello.
Good to have you on the show. Thanks so much. I want to throw the phone numbers out early because we're talking about the March on Washington, and we'd love to hear from you if you were there, either in 63, 2013, or both. Give us a call at 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So, John and Bill, I want to start with you because both of you were at the march in 63, and both of you, I believe, went back in 2013. I know you did, John.
I did not.
You? You
No,
did not?
no.
Okay. So let's go back to 63. Tell us what was going on. I'm going to start with you, Bill. What was happening in your life at that time? How old were you? Give us a sense of how you wound up in Washington.
Well, I was already there. I just graduated from college, Fisk University, where, as you know, many of the sit-ins began. And I had an internship with the Department of Commerce during the summer, just prior to going to grad school at Stanford. So I was actually in Washington, living near DuPont Circle, working at the Department of Commerce, so not very far from where the march began. Mm-hmm. I wasn't one of those who had to come on a bus. I was already there.
Were you already active in the civil rights movement?
I had been a little bit active in the beginning in Nashville. I attended some of Reverend James Lawson's discussions of nonviolence. I did not do much participation. I wasn't particularly nonviolent myself, but I admired very much what John and Diane and all the others were doing in the early period.
And so now, John, where were you and what was going on in your life at the time?
I was a senior in seminary at that time and had graduated of Wake Forest University in 61 and was in seminary because I felt that the white institutional church must have the same level of commitment to the civil rights movement as the black institutional church, and I wanted that credential. Mm-hmm. I'd been involved. I was in the third phase of the sit-ins at the Woolworths in Greensboro, and not the initial group, but the third phase, and I was the chairperson of the social ethics committee there at Southeastern Seminary, and had been involved with civil rights, and frankly, to tell you the truth, The president almost kicked me out of seminary because of my advocacy.
Wow.
Even though our seminary was integrated. We had black students there who were entering the ministry. So,
But this whole idea of actually going out and protesting in public was a problem for him.
Yes, yes, he just didn't really get it. I even said, Dr. Binkley, even you. And he went ballistic.
Wow,
So,
my goodness.
But I'm here today.
So tell me, gentlemen, then give me a sense of the feel that day when you actually went over to the monument. I'll start with you, Bill.
It was a combination of a festive situation, but also a very serious situation. One knew that everybody was there on a mission, and of course there had been a lot of build-up by Rustin's knowledge of organization and so on had been discussed a lot in the newspapers. We had heard a lot of A. Philip Randolph's voice intoning about the importance of this. We all knew about the sit-ins because there had been several years of sit-ins at Nashville. The Freedom Rides had gone on, and a lot of students had participated in that from Fisk and from other areas. So it was a serious affair, and a lot of students who had been a part of that were there, and we mingled in the crowds. So there was a lot of expectation. We thought this was an important juncture. We didn't know where it was going, but we knew that a lot had happened that was very serious, and something more had to be done.
Did you know that you were making history? I mean, did you have that feeling?
I had a sense when standing there at the Lincoln Memorial. We had such a number of people. But the other thing is, once one heard this litany of speakers, with the capstone, of course, of Martin Luther King speaking, one couldn't come away with not feeling that indeed this was an historical episode. And that was very important. All the speakers were good as far as I was concerned. And then there was Martin Luther King, who, of course, was superb.
And John, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no social media back then. How did the word get out? How did you find out about what was going on and the fact that they wanted people there?
Through friends and we were connected with, coming from Wake Forest, we were connected somewhat with the civil rights movement and knew this event was going to be happening. 3 of us from seminary in a Volkswagen Bug went to Washington. I was aware of the importance because it was a dialogue that we were having. And that was, as I said earlier, the reason for my being there in seminary was I wanted the credential that I could move some things forward. After the, if I may capture the moment, what really brought me to a sense of a higher level of awareness was the fact that all of us were there assembled at the base of the Washington Monument, waiting for Dr. King to take the first step to lead us to the Lincoln Memorial. That, I still get goosebumps, as you can probably see. Yeah. It was that sense of reality that, and it's also as a white person, that I went there with the reality that this is not an option. This is not something that I can ever walk away from. And that was the confirming moment there that this is who John Whitley is. And
the fact that all the races came together, because, we always talk about civil rights and the first thing people think about is African Americans, but there were people from everywhere, from all walks of life.
I have a feeling that about at least a third of the group gathered were white folk. And that, as Dr. King had said, we're coming here for that common bond because it affects all of us.
So Cassandra, take us back, and from a historical perspective, what was going on behind the scenes when all of this came together? Because while we always focus on Dr. King, it was actually a coalition of the Big Six, as they called them, I believe, and there were many groups that came together to make this happen.
You always had the core of the NAACP and the Urban League, but they were really somewhat conservative compared to some of the other groups like the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Of course, the most radical of all of them was SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was really founded by Ella Jo Baker, who was born in Norfolk.
Right.
And you had labor unions. They were an important component, and that's where A. Philip Randolph came in, because he had been the head of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. And so these kinds of organizations were very, very important in coming together. Among the planners, they were very interested in all of these organizations coming together. Of course, we know that the Nation of Islam stayed out of it. In fact, Malcolm X called it the Farce on Washington instead of the March on Washington. And he would later actually change his mind about the importance of really advocating from different viewpoints. A lot of people don't know that the primary focus was not just civil rights, but tied into that was jobs. And so as history has gone on in talking about the March on Washington, they've whittled it down to basic things that seem to make people comfortable. And that's King's dream. And not the main message. That was part of the main message, but that wasn't actually even a part of his original speech. The main message was that we're at a precipice in our country and we need to change if we're going to move forward. And that was, if you really listened to King's full speech, that was the message he was saying, that segregation and discrimination harmed the nation. It didn't just harm blacks. It didn't just harm whites. It harmed our nation. And for the nation to move forward, then we need to overcome this. We need to push aside that past and move on. And of course, behind the scenes, you had people like Strom Thurmond, who was working very hard against the civil rights movement. You had J. Edgar Hoover, who was using the FBI to undermine the civil rights movement, as well as to actually allow criminal activities, assaults, and so forth to against the civil rights workers, while at the same time maintaining that the job of the FBI was not to protect the citizens of the country.
As a matter of fact, there was in the PBS special, The March, which aired on Tuesday night, they were talking about how Hoover requested the opportunity to bug the phones and to listen because they would determine that there were communists involved in there. Going back to the other parts of the speech and so forth, Al Sharpton brought up on Saturday when the commemorative march, part of Martin Luther King's speech that talked about the check and what what that's all about. Let's listen to that clip first.
"50 years ago, Dr. King said that America gave blacks a check that bounced in the Bank of Justice and was returned marked insufficient funds. Well, we've redeposited the check. But guess what? It bounced again. But when we look at the reason this time, it was marked stop payment. They have the money to bail out banks. They have the money to bail out major corporations. They have the money to give tax benefits to the rich. They have the money for the 1%. But when it comes to Head Start, when it comes to municipal workers, when it comes to our teachers, they stop the check. We gonna make you make the check good, or we gonna close down the bank."
Bill, sounds like the same issues.
Exactly.
In the sense.
And I've listened to a lot of these talk shows, and they've always raised the question, what would King think now where he's still alive? And Sharpton, I think, hits the nail on the head. He would be both, I think, saddened and outraged at the conditions now. Yes, we have progressed a great deal, but in point of fact, when you think of the incarceration of minorities, blacks in particular, when you think of the problems of our economy, the disparities in income, when you think about
unemployment rates,
and the overt attempts to deprive people of voting, which King stood for, obviously, then that would have saddened him a great deal. So there is still a lot to be done, as Sharpton says. The promissory note still is out there. And it's, in addition to the dream, which is obviously an inspiration and a vision, now we need activity. We need, indeed, far more forceful activity, more, as the SNCC people would say, more direct action in order to accomplish these things.
John, did you have a reaction?
Well, I think the thing that impressed me continually was Dr. King saying about the fierce urgency of now. And I think that's what Reverend Sharpton was saying also, that we will not step back. We will not let go, because there has not been the investment in people that this country is capable of doing. And that was the thing that caught me in 1963 and caught me in 2013, that there is this sense of urgency, fierce urgency.
Cassandra?
You know, a lot of people, you asked me earlier about the background. You know, a lot of people don't realize that the 1963 March on Washington was also a commemoration and call to arms about the Emancipation Proclamation. Yes. That in 1863, 100 years prior to that, there were promises made at that point. And where have we come? Well, we've moved from being a nation of owning slaves to being a nation that said that slavery was wrong. But we really did not add that other piece, which is equality. Freedom and equality are two entirely different things. And so the March on Washington was saying, yes, this is where we've come since 1863, and we don't want people to forget about the Emancipation Proclamation, because that document, as well as the 13th Amendment, reminds us that since 1776 we have not all been free, as George W. Bush said in 2007 during our commemoration of Jamestown. Instead, it hasn't been this long history of freedom. It has been a dream that we've had of freedom, but we're not there yet, and it's been fraught with all kinds of obstacles. And these are obstacles that have been put forward by the federal government as well as by state governments, as well as by individuals. And those issues still remain. You still have people like the Cook brothers who are using their money to stop equality and to stop fairness in the states. That's not new. It's just that people have forgotten, and they need to be reminded. And so the March on Washington was not only a demand to the nation. It was a demand, but it was even more importantly a reminder to the people who were, if not there in physical form, they were there in spirit, that this is what it was all about. But the nation was afraid. And if I could, I'd like to just kind of read you a couple of excerpts. On Meet the Press, right before the march, Roy Wilkins and Martin Luther King Jr. Were on the program, and they were grilled by the reporters as if they were committing a criminal act by having this march.
Because there was a lot of worry about violence and that they were going to tear up D.C. and so forth.
They actually said it would be impossible to bring more, and I'm quoting, more than 100,000 militant Negroes into Washington without incidents and possible rioting. That was what was said on Meet the Press. Okay, Life magazine reported that that the Capitol was suffering, quote, its worst case of invasion jitters since the first Battle of Bull Run. So they were likening the march to the beginning of the Civil War.
Wow.
I mean, that tells you the Pentagon had 19,000 troops in the suburbs waiting to quell a riot. The D.C. hospital was on riot patrol. They canceled all except for mandatory operations. They even canceled the games at the D.C. Stadium. That is how bad it was. And then, of course, Congress left Washington, D.C.
So it's just cleared up. Did you all feel that? When you were actually at the march, did you feel all the turmoil around you that was going on because everybody was so nervous that you all were going to act up?
No, I didn't feel that turmoil at all. I didn't get any sense that there was going to be a riot or any disruption of any sort. What I got was simply an eagerness to be part of this change, this transformation. That, for example, between, let's say, the beginnings of the sit-ins in Nashville and North Carolina, and later on, 1963, you had obviously freedom riders and so on. You had a lot of things that brought up issues about where we were going with the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And so what I heard was indeed a kind of balance sheet of where we've been and where we have to go. And this, I thought, was the genius of all of the speakers. You had the union people, Randolph and Walter Reuther, of course, representing the auto workers. You had even Josephine Baker there giving a wonderful speech from France and shouting out the word freedom, by the way, which I've never seen quoted here, but she did. And then you had King, who crafted a speech so beautifully and so inclusively, where indeed in his languages, in his metaphors, he first of all began with connection with Lincoln by saying 5 score, connecting with Lincoln's 4 score and so on. And then he brought together the issues in Mississippi and the South with those in New York, and then connected that with California. And with all of this, in a sense, I saw him trying to, first of all, bring the nation together, but also suggest what the agenda had to be for the future, and how indeed it's well grounded in biblical language. Is well grounded in the traditions of the United States. Mm-hmm. And that was, to me, the genius of what he did, to bring all this together in one wonderful speech.
Wow. Our phone lines are lit up, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Lydia joins us from the Eastern Shore. Hi, Lydia. You're on the air.
Thank you, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
I was a Southerner, white Southerner who was from Norfolk and had been raised in segregated schools and never gone to an integrated school. And I had always had an enormous sense of guilt, as I think some Southerners did, about what I saw around me of segregation and Jim Crow and the signs for separate facilities and as I say, I attended segregated schools. I had really been moved emotionally by Dr. King. He was, to me, the solution for white Southerners who felt guilty about the existence of segregation in the South. He was the way. I mean, if he didn't achieve his dream, then I felt that violence would come, and that he was preaching nonviolence and forgiveness for whites and wanting to involve them in talking about inclusion. It was very moving emotionally. I wrote a column about how Dr. King was our sort of savior for Southerners, white Southerners who disagreed with segregation when I was at Sweetbriar College. Mm-hmm. And I graduated in 1962 and went to work for the Washington Post. And I remember vividly what your guests were talking about that climate of fear in D.C. President Kennedy himself thought it was going to be absolutely violent. But one of your guests said, and he's absolutely right, because I was at that march, not because I believed in it, although I did believe in it. I have to be honest, I was sent there by the Post. They covered every square corner of the area of the march because they were so scared of violence. They had everybody, including copy boys, they had to let them know if somebody was shot or hit or whatever. Wow. They were so scared of violence, they just emptied the building.
Lydia, I have to, excuse me for interrupting you, but I have to ask, what was the conversation like in the Post newsroom as you were being sent out to cover this story?
Well, we all knew that the white establishment in Washington, you remember, was very much a southern city in the 60s. You remember the famous quote of President Kennedy? He said Washington was a city of northern charm and southern efficiency. It was still a very southern city in some ways. And people were terrified, the cliff dwellers, as they called them, the old-time residents. And I lived in Georgetown at the time. Were really scared of this march. But when you got there, the sense was of exhilaration. I don't know what else to call it. Of happiness, of calm. It was so different from what had been predicted. There were whites and blacks. There were people who were picnicking. There were people who were singing. It was just an extraordinary scene. I've never forgotten it. It's one of the most important moments of my life.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. We really do appreciate it. Wow. John, what do you think about her saying, though, that this helped for Southern whites who felt guilty?
Well, being one of those Southern whites who have never felt guilt but have felt anger that we, white folk, have permitted this type of climate to prevail. I can understand where she is coming from, but I feel that whole concept or that internal feeling of I'm really ticked off that we have been a party of what this is about, and this shall cease.
You know what I'm curious about, and I'll start with you, John, but let me just do this one thing. If you're just joining us, it's an Another View history lesson focusing on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. We're talking with historians Cassandra Newby-Alexander, William Alexander, and with Dr. John Whitley of the Williamsburg-York James City County chapter of the NAACP. What was the conversation in your family, John, did you run in and say, I'm going to the march, or did you keep it quiet?
I had a single mom, the town librarian. She didn't know until I had been there. As I'd shared with you earlier prior to the program, I wrote Dr. King a letter after the march saying that I really wanted this is who I am. And it was with my home address, and I really feel that possibly Dr. King responded and my mother destroyed it, because I know the placards that we marched with says Seminarians for Equality. I had one under my bed. That was burned, and she showed me the ashes in the fireplace. So it was, it's that type of environment, but loved her dearly. But the family environment was not that conducive. But my stepfather was he's the one that led me in about 1953 into the sense of equality. He was, though, from Weldon, North Carolina. He had been in New York City. He helped me understand what it means to reach out and touch and be with your black brothers and sisters. There was a little difference of attitude in the house, shall I say. But he helped me take the right steps.
And what about your household, Bill?
Well, that wasn't an issue, really. I mean,
everybody was all for it.
My father, my brother, grandparents, and so on. They all believed that this was long overdue, that it was a remarkable thing, that it was obviously well organized. But even if it hadn't been, the fact is that so much was at stake. And all of us felt we had to be there. Mm-hmm. And I had no negative responses from my family.
Cassandra, you were a very young child at this time, as was I. Yes. But do you remember, you didn't go to the march, but you said your family watched.
Yes, I was 5.5 years old when the march happened, and my younger brother had just been born, so he was only about 2 months old at the time. And I remember watching the march, but see, I grew up in a family that was very civil rights oriented, and from as early as I can remember, my parents were very firm about standing your ground. I mean, I hate to put it in those terms, but but not to allow somebody to trample on your rights. And I remember as an 11-year-old going to a Presbyterian camp and having one of the camp workers push me down because he was such a bigot, and he was 17 years old, and he wanted to force me to comply. And every time he pushed me down, I stood back up, and he would push me down again, and I would stand back up. And I did it automatically. I didn't do it, thinking this is what I got angry. Every time he pushed me down, I got angrier and stood up. And so I even though there are some states who've sort of gone back into the antebellum period with their stand your ground laws, and it's really antebellum period. But even standing your ground is really what the civil rights movement was about. Whether it for some people, they couldn't stand their ground without reacting violently, while others stood their ground, and they had to be really trained not to physically react when someone would push you down. And so I grew up in a household that meant that I would stand up. And I was willing to even get hit. And I would somehow make sure I stood up. We were really trained in nonviolence in my household. Mm-hmm. But that was the theme, and it was a very, very important and powerful theme.
I want to play two clips. One is from John Lewis from Wednesday, the actual day of the march, and then one from President Obama that same day. And just want to talk on the other side about kind of the differences yet the sameness in terms of their message. Let's start with John Lewis.
In 1963, we could not register to vote simply because of the color of our skin. We had to pay a poll tax, pass a so-called literacy test, count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, or the number of jelly beans in a jar. Hundreds and thousands of people were arrested and jailed throughout the South for trying to participate in the democratic process. Medgar Evers had been killed in Mississippi, and that's why we told President Kennedy we intended to march on Washington to demonstrate the need for equal justice and equal opportunity in America.
The arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it doesn't bend on its own. To secure the gains this country has made requires constant vigilance, not complacency. Whether by challenging those who erect new barriers to the vote, or ensuring that the scales of justice work equally for all and the criminal justice system is not simply a pipeline from underfunded schools to overcrowded jails, it requires vigilance.
Bill, the vote. Both speeches. I mean, both. John's talking about from 63. The president's talking about right now.
Right now. And it's the same thing. John is one of the undersung heroes of the 20th century as far as I'm concerned. He's been truly committed from I guess, the time he was maybe in a cradle to now. But what leadership he gave was tremendous, obviously. And in terms of his being able to pinpoint the specifics, the needs and so on. And he's perfectly correct. I mean, these are things that have not been addressed and haven't been addressed well. And Barack Obama obviously is focusing on also that pipeline, as he put it, from the schools, from hopelessness to the prisons, and that incarceration issue. And these are things that are not being addressed well today. And this was an important situation where they could be brought out. And I think this has to be part of our agenda. But politically, they're in the back door area.
One of the things that, because John Lewis was in charge of SNCC, which was the youth group, basically, and the youth, John, they were a key part of this march. Not only the march, but also of the civil rights movement in terms of bringing our young people in. And I'm curious as to how each of you feel about where are our young people today? Are we still in that march mode, or are young people today just not quite understanding what's going on?
Disappointedly, as recently as Monday evening, I was talking to a young man. He's 24 years old, 2-year graduate of William & Mary. And I was talking about Saturday, the march, and he said, what was that all about? And so I had to think, wait a minute, this is not good. And I don't want to say that all youth are there, but I'd say a majority, unfortunately, what is this about? And I think that calls upon us that fierce sense of urgency to address this with them.
Mm-hmm. Cassandra.
Unfortunately, with the start of the standards of learning, the SOLs, they've eliminated the history that our young people need to be taught. They have couched American history as this one spectacle of one little factoid after the other, but it's all about how we're all one big happy family. And that's not the history of the United States. And if you ignore the grappling, if you ignore the fighting, if you ignore all of the rancor that's a part of our history, then you don't have perspective about where we've come from, how far we've come from, and where we really need to go. Instead, there's this complacency that's really shrouded or suffocating. It's a suffocating environment from the mass consumer society that gets people to only think about which next iPod or iPhone am I going to purchase, as opposed to, why do I really need to vote? You have too many young people who think that voting is all about the Electoral College. And I have to remind them, there is only one election, one person who the Electoral College even deals with, and that's the president. But all the other elections have to do with whether you get tolls on every bridge and tunnel around here, or whether you have road repair going on, or whether you have money funneled into the schools, or as in the case of our state, we have all these companies that are getting tax breaks. We don't know why, but when they get them, it's permanent. And so, and that's money that's draining out of the public coffers.
And Bill, what about the responsibility also, though? Because I know in all of our households, there was conversation about the movement. And there was also a movement going on at that time. But are we still, you feel that parents are still having this kind of conversation in the household?
Well, properly speaking, there is no movement right now. We're living, unfortunately, in an era of narcissism and opportunism, and a lot of our young people have bought into this. We don't have the credible leadership out there that we had, say, back in King's period. So we wistfully look at King and Frederick Douglass and others, and possibly remember vaguely the time when the struggle was there. But right now, we have a government that's, for the most part, stymied in just about every direction. Even though, to his credit, Barack Obama has tried to enlarge the middle class, the fact is very little has been said about the impoverished people in this country. Very little has been said about the people who are incarcerated, and the numbers equal or surpass those in college among black kids. So these are issues that are addressed maybe on talk shows, on a few of them. Some of the students know about these things and they worry about it, but there are very few coalitions that are really addressing these, and very few speakers who are coming out and making this the important part of their agenda.
Okay. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Anastasia joins us from Southern Maryland. Hi, Anastasia. You're on the air.
Hey, Miss Barbara. How are you?
I'm fine.
So I went to the march this past weekend, and it was absolutely incredible. And I know you guys were just discussing the youth involvement in it. And I went really, really early, and I was expecting that the march would be around like noon, and unfortunately it wasn't until later. But when I went, there was a whole bunch of youth involvement. There was, I don't remember what it was, but I remember a whole bunch of young kids came up and were talking about it. This one 15-year-old girl gave a speech about how the youth need to be involved. I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. The aura that was around, it was incredible. And I left around noon, and when I was walking back up Independence Ave, you could see several different groups were marching. There was one group, I think it was the nurses union. They marched from the World War II Memorial, and they just kept going. And it was so cool to see so many people united on so many different issues, but still having the same issues, same difficulties or problems that were happening in 1963.
Anastasia, what will you do with this information when you go back to school? By the way, Anastasia was one of our interns here at Another View this summer, so we appreciate you calling in. But when you go back to the University of Maryland, what will you do with this information?
Well, I'm trying to open up the NLGJA, the National Lesbian and Gay Journalism Association at the University of Maryland. We don't currently have a chapter, but I think it's something that's really important. And so I'm kind of talking to one of the guys. I believe he's the president or coordinator at Georgetown University or a college in D.C. But I'm going to try to set up something like that at Maryland. I want there to be more awareness. I want to get more students involved. That way, when I leave, if I'm a senior, when I leave, I don't want this kind of to die out. I want it to be something that continues and I want to be able to have more students know what's going on. And I believe that when you start something, you got to keep it going.
Okay, Anastasia, thank you so much, and we wish you the best this semester at University of Maryland. Cassandra, young people on Norfolk State's campus, on ODU's campus, on Virginia State's campus, are they organized? Are they thinking about these issues?
I think that there are some small efforts. There is seemingly this sort of national effort to suppress a lot of student activism. And I think it's a very distracting thing when you're only talking about organizations that are socially oriented, the fraternities, the sororities, all of that. And our nation has really kind of gone into this comfort zone, thinking everything is fine, and the world has been passing us by. And so perhaps there is a little bit more of an awakening, but they're nowhere near where they need to be in terms of waking up out of their slumber. I did want to mention, though, that one of the things that has not really been talked about is the lack of female participation in the original 1963 March on Washington.
That's true, because women were really relegated kind of to the background.
Not kind of. They were relegated to the background. They were basically no, don't be nice. They were told essentially this is a man thing. Black men have been put down, so sit down and shut up and let us take the lead. And I think it's important for us to understand that. How many places would you have a person who starts an organization like SNCC be relegated to only being the secretary as opposed to the president of the organization, as Ella Jo Baker was? You're talking about also at that time such a misogynistic mindset about women needing to sit down. And that was sort of the controversy that Louis Farrakhan started with his 200-man march, or 2 million man march, where, he wanted the women to stay home. And I think we were long over that. We were long over saying to people, okay, this is for us and not for you. And so I think that the recent march is trying to put a corrective to a lot of that and say, this is all of us, and we all have to be together, understanding that we are all intertwined. Male, female, people of different ethnicities, we are all intertwined. And if we're going to succeed in moving forward as a nation, we must see that this is all part of us. And if one group falls behind, we all fall behind.
And I think we need to recognize that the role of gays, lesbians, bisexual, transgender folk, and the recognition of that, of them in 2013. If only Rushton had been able to come forward and have the microphone, I think that would have been another declaration. And if I may add, talking about youth, we with our chapter of the NAACP are connected with the William and Mary chapter of the NAACP, and they are becoming visible and vocal. And we have a youth NAACP out of our high school based, which there's the hope that if others would mobilize through their chapters of NAACP, their youth organizations, to become visible and vocal, there will be a sense of hope.
Every generation needs to take its turns. Go ahead,
I think
Bill.
that's why it's so important what John said, that we understand what Bayard Rustin represented. Here's a fellow who had been put in prison for being against the Korean War. Here's a fellow who spent time in India studying Gandhi's nonviolence, and he's one of the major ones, along with James Lawson later, and then King himself, who communicated this idea to the civil rights workers. So I think the more emphasis we put on him, the more we understand him, the more indeed some of these issues will be dealt with. But based on what Anastasia was saying, I remember when Diane Nash transferred to Fisk, she was very concerned that nothing much was happening. And she wanted to know who's moving anything, who's changing things. And she got in touch with John Lewis, who had a number of telephones in his room, by the way, his campus room. And she became a great leader. Now, obviously, she was passed over in terms of having a major public role in 1963. But to Anastasia, I would say, be the change that you want to see. And I think people like Anastasia are going to be the ones to perhaps inject some activity into our own age. But I know before the 60s, things were very quiet in terms of the national scene, in terms of protesting against discrimination and so on. Then we had the movement, and then things went into a kind of lull because I guess people thought, well, it's been achieved. But the crucial role of 63 was that there had to be decisions made as to where the movement was going, because there was direct action, there was King's approach, there was the NAACP and Wilkins, and there was CORE. There were all these groups with their different agendas.
And we've only got about 4 minutes left, so gosh, I could talk to you all day about this. But I'm very curious, and Cassandra, I'll start with you, about how did those egos come together? Because I can imagine today, if we put all of these different groups, because they all came from a different perspective. So perhaps the lesson was that we had to attack the civil rights movement from all kinds of perspectives in order to be successful.
Well, the egos, I guess, were at least, confined to their little quarters. The real issue was that they were trying to kill segregation and discrimination. That was the overriding thing. That it wasn't a personal agenda involved in achieving that, though there were personal agendas playing out there. But they saw this overall goal in mind, and they knew that if they did not come together, that they would be picked off individually, because there was such a hard effort by the FBI to attack them, and they knew that. And because, of course, this march happened after the FBI sent King the letter to his home, referring to his sexual activities and threatening to reveal it. So there was very much an urgency that they needed to come together. They needed to show at least a solidified face, and they needed to put aside a lot of these egotisms.
Last question for each of you, and I'll get each perspective, starting with you, Bill. Could there be a march today? Is there an overarching thing going on in our society that would pull people together again?
I'm not sure what the actual issue would be. There would be a number of issues. Back then it was jobs and freedom. Today, obviously, the incarceration issue, the voting thing. I think more than anything, perhaps, the attempt to deprive blacks of voting would be the major issue that would galvanize people.
Dr. William Alexander from Norfolk State University, thank you so much for joining us. John, you got about 30 seconds.
There is no option. We have to realize, as Dr. King said in 63, it still lives today, that fierce urgency of now. It's calling for the bringing together of coalitions. As diverse opinions helped to lead us in 63, diverse people, whether they're gay, whomever, bringing coalitions together to say, we will not sit down.
Dr. John Whitley with the Williamsburg-York James City County NAACP. Thank you so much for being on the show. Cassandra, you got the last 30 seconds.
Okay, I think that the most important thing that people are actually coming to realize today is that our nation has to move forward. And that where we are today, all the people who want to stop things, who want to take us back to the past, they're dying out for the most part. And if you want the nation to survive and to move forward, you have to take control of things. And that's where I think we're going.
Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, history professor at Norfolk State University and the director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Really appreciate it, and we'll be right back. Hampton Roads' own Mike Tomlin became head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2007. 2 years later, he became the youngest coach to win a Super Bowl championship. But even with such success, nothing has stopped him from returning to his community to give back. Here's Lisa Godley with the story of Mike Tomlin.
Every year for the past 4 years, Mike Tomlin has made it his mission to give back to the community that helped shape and mold him as a child.
Really, it's a no-brainer for me. I come from this community. I had goals and dreams, and a lot of members of my community served as mentors for me in terms of helping me realize some of those things and really just providing the right perspective for me just to go about, living and chasing those dreams. So, me, I take it personal, and I believe that I have an obligation to pay it forward, and that's what I'm trying to do.
After graduating from Denby High School in Newport News, Tomlin then went on to play wide receiver at the College of William and Mary. Before being hired as the Pittsburgh Steelers coach, he gained experience coaching at various universities, including the University of Memphis, Arkansas State, and the University of Cincinnati, just to name a few. Tomlin says education is key when pursuing goals and dreams.
Regarding education, thankfully I'm blessed to be in a position where I meet a lot of people that are doing interesting and exciting things. And, almost 99.9% of those people, education is part of the formula. I don't care what your dreams are. Getting a quality education, a formal education, needs to be a component of it.
Tomlin understands the desire of young men to play professional sports, and he offers his insight on how to succeed.
The secret is there's no secret. It's not about what their goals are, what their mouth says their goals are. It's about what they're willing to do on a day-to-day basis to make those things happen. I think more than anything, I think that's the message that needs to be heard. They see a lot of sports stars performing and making it look easy, but that's their job to make it look easy. Those guys work extremely hard and diligent at mastering their craft, whatever it is.
He says his proudest moments as a coach surround his players once they've left the game for good.
There's probably moments of visiting with former players and seeing that they're doing well in life. Those are proud moments for me.
Coaching isn't Tomlin's only job. Mike is also a husband and a full-time dad and has introduced his two sons to the world of sports.
My sons play everything. Football, basketball, baseball, track. I keep them busy.
Mike Tomlin is the 10th African-American head coach in NFL history and the first for the Steelers. When asked about the Rooney Rule, which requires NFL teams to interview at least one minority candidate whenever there's a coaching or general manager opening, Tomlin says the system still has a ways to go.
Obviously, there's room for improvement. I think what's happened in the last hiring cycle this just past winter indicates that. I think we're continually looking to evolve in that area. It's good to be on the cutting edge in the world of sport. I think that, sport provides a venue for that.
As for the coming season and what teams may be the Steelers' biggest threats?
I hadn't spent a lot of time looking at the Joneses or the other people that we play, if you will. This time of year, I'm focused more about the growth and development of our people. I think there's going to be plenty of time to survey the field, and the picture will become clear over time.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
Oh, sorry to disagree with you, Mike Tomlin. Got to watch out for those Ravens. I know I'm going to start trouble here. This story was produced by Kiara Dunstan, a senior at Hampton University studying broadcast journalism, and an intern with Another View. If you've enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. Simply go to WHRV.org, click on 89.5, and then on Listen. You'll find Another View on the first page. And be sure to visit our website, anotherviewradio.org, to sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming programs. Next week, our favorite relationship coach returns. Alvian Lyons is coming back to talk with us about living life as an interracial couple. Should be an interesting discussion. For producer Lisa Godley, audio engineer Victor Bowen, Ashley Dillard, who answered our phones, I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Hope you have a wonderful holiday weekend, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.